Alligator begins with A. A. Alligator begins with A. B. Bear begins with B. B. Bear begins with B. C. Camel begins with C. C. Camel begins with C. D. Dolphin begins with D. D. Dolphin begins with D. E. Elephant begins with E. E. Elephant begins with E. F. Flamingo begins with F. F. Flamingo begins with F. G. Giraffe begins with G. G. Giraffe begins with G. H. Hippopotamus begins with H. H. Hippopotamus begins with H. I. Iguana begins with I. I. Iguana begins with I. J. Jaguar begins with J. J. Jaguar begins with J. K. Koala begins with K. K. Koala begins with K. L. Lion begins with L. L. Lion begins with L. M. Monkey begins with M. M. Monkey begins with M. N. Nightingale begins with N. N. Nightingale begins with N. O. Ostrich begins with O. O. Ostrich begins with O. P. Penguin begins with P. P. Penguin begins with P. Q. Quail begins with Q. Q. Quail begins with Q. R. Rhinoceros begins with R. R. Rhinoceros begins with R. S. Seal begins with S. S. Seal begins with S. T. Tiger begins with T. T. Tiger begins with T. U. Oriole begins with U. U. Oriole begins with U. Vulture begins with V. V. Vulture begins with V. W. Walrus begins with W. W. Walrus begins with W. X. X-ray fish begins with X. X. X-ray fish begins with X. Y. Yak begins with Y. Y. Yak begins with Y. Z. Zebra begins with Z. Z. Zebra begins with Z.